We bring ancient wisdom to life through modern technology, creating a bridge between the lessons of the past and the challenges of tomorrow. Join our unique exploration of what it means to be human. Subscribe now and help us build a bridge to the future.
This isn't a story about getting even. It's a story about what a man will do when he watches someone he loves being slowly erased. I need you to understand that before I tell you the rest. My name isn't important. What's important is that I have a daughter. Her name is Claire. And she is the kind of person who lights up a room without trying. She became a teacher. 3rd grade. She spent her own money on classroom supplies, stayed late to help kids who were struggling, went home exhausted, and still called me on her drive just to catch up. That's who she is. That's who she was when she married into the Harmon family. Her husband's name is Brent. I want to be fair to Brent because for a long time I thought he was a decent man who just had a difficult father. That's what I told myself. That's what Claire told herself, too. We were both wrong, but we were wrong slowly, the way you don't notice water rising until it's already at your chest. His father, I'll call him Gerald because that's his name, ran a regional logistics company outside of Columbus, Ohio. Mid-size operation, maybe 40 employees at its peak. Gerald had built it from nothing in the 80s, which I respect. What I don't respect is what that success did to him. It made him believe that everything he touched belonged to him. His business, his house, his son, and eventually, his son's wife. Claire and Brent got married when she was 29. The wedding was beautiful. I walked her down the aisle and I remember looking at Brent and thinking, he's nervous, good. A man should be nervous when he's promising to take care of someone else's child. What I didn't know was that Gerald was sitting in the front row already planning how Claire would fit into the Harmon family structure. And in that structure, daughters-in-law had a very specific role. They served. I didn't see it right away. The first year, things seemed fine. They lived in a house about 12 minutes from Gerald and his wife Miriam. Close, but not too close. Brent was working at his father's company. Gerald had brought him in as an operations manager, which sounded impressive and paid reasonably well. Claire kept teaching. They seemed happy. Then Brent's younger brother got married and moved to Phoenix. Suddenly, Gerald and Miriam were alone in that big house, and suddenly family dinners became every Sunday, and then Sunday dinners became Saturday afternoons too, and then Saturday afternoons became, can you come help Miriam with the garden on Thursday? And Claire would go because she didn't want to cause friction, and Brent would say, it's just easier if you go. And I would hear about all of this on our phone calls, and something in the back of my mind would go quiet and cold. But I told myself, families are complicated. You marry a person, you marry their people. Give it time. I gave it time. 3 years into the marriage, Claire got pregnant. I was so happy I cried in my car in a parking lot like a fool. Boy or girl didn't matter. I was going to be a grandfather. I drove to Columbus the weekend they told me, took them both to dinner, and I noticed something that night I hadn't seen before. Every time Claire spoke at the table, she looked at Brent first. Just a glance. Just half a second. Like she was checking whether it was okay to say what she was about to say. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Old men see things that aren't there. She lost the baby at 11 weeks. I won't go into the details because they're not mine to share, but I will tell you that I drove to Columbus the day she called me, and I found her in that house alone. Brent was at work. Gerald had called Brent back in because there was a situation with a vendor that needed handling. Miriam had come over in the morning and left by noon. Claire was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She wasn't crying. She was just sitting there, very still, the way a person sits when they've run out of ways to feel. I sat across from her and I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, do you want to come stay with me for a few days? She looked at the table. I don't think Brent would like that. That was the moment. I want to be clear about that. That was the exact moment I understood that my daughter had been living inside something I hadn't named yet. I didn't push. I made her tea. I stayed until Brent got home around 7, and I watched how my daughter moved differently when he walked to the door. Smaller, more careful. And I watched how Gerald called twice during the hour I was there, and both times Brent stepped into the other room to answer. I drove home that night with my hands tight on the wheel and my jaw aching from holding everything in. I started paying closer attention after that. Not in a dramatic way. I just listened more carefully on our calls. I noticed she stopped mentioning her work friends. She used to talk about her colleague Patrice all the time. Funny stories about the teacher's lounge, that stopped. She stopped mentioning weekend plans that didn't involve the Harmons. When I asked about her classroom, she'd give me short answers and then redirect to something Miriam needed, or something Gerald had said, or something Brent wanted to do. She was disappearing, and she was doing it so gradually she didn't even know it was happening. About 8 months after the miscarriage, I drove up to surprise her for her birthday. I called Brent ahead of time, not Claire. I wanted it to be a real surprise. He seemed fine with it. Said they'd be at the Harmon house for a birthday dinner. Gerald was hosting. I said that was perfect, I'd come by. I pulled up to Gerald's house around 6 in the evening. Through the front window, I could see Miriam and Brent sitting at the dining room table. Gerald was in his recliner in the living room, watching television. I rang the bell. Brent let me in. I asked where Claire was. He pointed toward the back of the house. I found my daughter in the kitchen. She was wearing an apron. She was cooking. Not just helping, she was doing everything. She'd made a pot roast, a green bean casserole, roasted potatoes, rolls from scratch. The table was set. The wine was open, and she was washing the prep dishes while the food finished. Alone. On her birthday. While her husband and his parents sat in the other room. I stood in the doorway and she turned around and saw me, and her face did something complicated. Happy to see me, yes, but also something like embarrassment, like she didn't want me to see this. "Dad," she said. "You're here." "I'm here," I said. I helped her carry the food out. Gerald acknowledged me with a nod. Miriam said, "Oh, you made it," like I was a pleasant surprise at an event she'd organized. Brent pulled out my chair. Nobody thanked Claire for the food. Nobody mentioned it was her birthday until I brought it out the cake I'd brought. And even then, Gerald just said, "Oh, is today the day?" and went back to eating. I sat at that table and I smiled and I made conversation and I ate my daughter's food. And inside I was very, very quiet in the way I only get when I'm deciding something. On my drive home, I called my older brother, who is a retired attorney. I talked to him for almost an hour. I didn't have a plan yet, but I was starting to build one. Over the next several months, I started asking Claire careful questions, not leading questions. Not "Does Brent treat you okay?" because she would have defended him. Just questions that let her talk. About the Harmon Company, about Gerald's business, about Brent's role there. She knew more than I expected. She'd heard things. Gerald complained at dinner about contracts they'd lost. Brent had mentioned twice that his father was restructuring, which in Gerald's vocabulary apparently meant cutting corners and hoping no one noticed. One of the drivers had quit and taken 3 others with him over a dispute about hours. Claire had heard Gerald on the phone once, very late, talking about extending a line of credit. None of it meant anything to her. To me, it meant something. I had spent 31 years in commercial real estate finance. I know what a distressed business sounds like. I know the vocabulary of a company trying to hold itself together with tape and confidence. Gerald's company was bleeding, and he was the last person who would ever admit it. I hired someone, a business analyst. He came recommended by a colleague, and I asked him to do a discrete assessment of Harmon Logistics. It took about 6 weeks. What he found was not surprising, but it was clarifying. The company was carrying significant debt. 2 major contracts had not been renewed. Their primary insurance carrier had raised premiums substantially after an incident the previous year, and Gerald, who owned 100% of the business, had taken out a personal loan against it 18 months earlier that was coming due. The company wasn't just struggling, it was standing at the edge. I thought about what to do with this for a long time. I want to be honest about that. I didn't move fast, and I didn't move out of anger. I moved because I watched my daughter shrink a little more every month, and I understood that waiting was its own kind of decision. I called my brother again. Then I called a business attorney in Columbus. Then I made some calls to people I'd worked with over the decades. One of them had a private equity contact who was looking for distressed acquisitions in logistics. I told them I might have something. Then I waited for the right moment. It came on a Saturday in March. Claire called me, and her voice was different, flat. She told me she'd asked Brent if they could talk about possibly moving. Not far, just to a different neighborhood, a little more space, thinking about the future. She'd found a house she liked and wanted to at least discuss it. Brent had said he'd think about it. Then Gerald had called. And 2 hours later, Brent came back and told her the idea didn't make sense right now, that his father needed them close by, and that she was being selfish for even asking. Selfish. My daughter, who cooked for that family and cleaned that house and showed up every time they called, was told she was selfish for wanting a home of her own. I said, "Claire, are you happy?" Long pause. "I'm fine, Dad. That's not what I asked." Another pause. Longer. Then, very quietly, "I don't know." That night, I called the business attorney in Columbus. I told him I was ready to move. What happened over the next 8 weeks is complicated in its details but simple in its shape. My contact introduced me to a private equity group that had been watching Harmon Logistics for a while. Gerald had been approached before about selling. He'd refused, because Gerald Harmon does not sell what Gerald Harmon built. But Gerald Harmon also needed to extend his credit line, and his bank was not feeling generous. I did not buy the company myself. I am not a wealthy man in a dramatic sense. What I am is someone who spent 3 decades building relationships with people who are. I came in as a minority stake investor as part of a larger acquisition. I put in enough that I would be at the table. I put in enough that it mattered. Gerald sold because he had no real choice. His attorney negotiated hard and got him decent terms, which was fine. I didn't need Gerald to suffer financially. What I needed was for Gerald to no longer own the thing that gave him power over my daughter's life. What I needed was for Brent to understand, for the first time, that the empire was not his inheritance. The deal closed on a Thursday. Gerald found out who I was, that I was involved, when the new management team introduced themselves. I'm told he sat very still for a long time. I'm told he asked to speak with his son privately. I don't know exactly what was said in that room. I know that Brent called Claire that evening, and that Claire called me an hour after that, and her voice was shaking. "Dad, what did you do?" "I made an investment," I said. "A good one, I think." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Gerald is furious." "I expect so. Brent is." She paused. "He doesn't know what to say to me." "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to say anything back." I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Claire 3 weeks after the deal closed, because it's the part of this story I think about most. She called me on a Tuesday evening. I was in my backyard. The sun was going down. She said she'd been thinking a lot. She said she'd talked to someone, a therapist, finally, which she'd been putting off for 2 years because Brent had said they didn't need outside help. She said the therapist had helped her see some things clearly. She said she'd been asking herself a question she'd been afraid to ask. The question was, who am I outside of this family? She said she'd realized she didn't know the answer anymore. We talked for almost 2 hours that night, about her classroom, about the kids she'd taught, about Patrice in the teacher's lounge, about a trip to Portugal she'd been wanting to take for years but kept putting off. We talked about the kind of life she'd imagined when she was younger. She cried a little. I let her. Before she hung up, she said, "I think I need to make some changes." I said, "I'll support whatever you decide." She separated from Brent 4 months later, not because of anything dramatic, no single breaking point, just the accumulation of everything that had been too small to name on its own, but was enormous when she finally looked at it all at once. The therapy helped. Time helped. I think the fact that Gerald's grip had loosened helped too. The pressure that had held a certain shape in place was different now, and without it, Brent didn't seem to know who he was either. The divorce was quiet. Claire kept teaching. She took that trip to Portugal in the fall. She sent me photos every day. Sunlight on old stone, markets, a sunset from a hilltop village. She looked like herself again. She looked like the person who used to call me from her car just to catch up. I'm not going to tell you Gerald learned some great lesson. Men like Gerald don't usually. I'm told he's involved in a smaller operation now, a consulting arrangement with a nephew. I'm told he doesn't talk about the logistics company. I don't need him to feel anything in particular. What I needed was for my daughter to have room to breathe, and she has that now. I'm 67 years old. I've made a lot of decisions in my life. Some good, some I'd take back. This one I would make again without hesitating, not because of what it cost Gerald, but because of what it gave Claire. She called me last Sunday. She'd just come from a friend's house. Patrice, the one from the teacher's lounge. She was laughing about something, I don't even remember what, just laughing freely, the way she used to, before everything got heavy. And I sat in my chair and listened, and I thought, there it is. That's the thing I was protecting. That's the price of dignity. Sometimes you pay it yourself, so someone you love doesn't have to keep paying it forever. If you're watching this and you see someone you love being made smaller, day by day, in ways too quiet to easily name, trust what you're seeing. Don't wait until you have proof of something dramatic. The slow erosion is real too, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to look away. Subscribe if you believe stories like these matter. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And has someone ever stood up for you the way you deserved? I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot since all of this happened. Not in any mystical sense, just the plain, observable truth that what we allow tends to grow, and what we refuse to see tends to deepen. Gerald didn't become the man he was overnight. He became him slowly, through years of people stepping aside, nodding along, keeping the peace. Brent learned from watching his father that the people around you exist to accommodate you. And Claire, who was kind and patient by nature, stepped into that world and got gradually reshaped by it. Not through cruelty exactly, but through the steady, daily pressure of a family that never once asked what she needed. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about on all those long drives back from Columbus. Not the big moments, the small ones, the cold cup of tea. The glance she gave Brent before she spoke. The birthday dinner where my daughter cooked every dish and nobody said her name. People talk about moral failure like it's always loud, like it announces itself. In my experience, it's usually quiet. It's a husband who says, "It's just easier if you go." It's a family that accepts service without acknowledgement so many times that the person serving eventually stops expecting anything different. It's a father, and I include myself here, who noticed something was wrong and told himself he was probably overreading it and gave it more time, and gave it more time and gave it more time again. Intelligence isn't just knowing things. It's being honest with yourself about what you're seeing, even when the honest version is harder to sit with than the comfortable one. I told myself a comfortable story for too long. Claire is fine. Families are complicated. Give it time. None of that was wisdom. It was avoidance dressed up as patience. What I eventually understood is that resilience, real resilience, the kind worth having, isn't about enduring indefinitely. Claire had endured plenty. She was strong in the way that people who have learned to absorb pain quietly are strong. And that kind of strength can look like stability from the outside, while something essential is hollowing out on the inside. The strength I wanted for her was different, the kind that knows when enough is enough. The kind that can look at a situation clearly and say, "This is not what I deserve, and I am going to do something about it." She found that. Not because of what I did with the business. I want to be honest about that. What I did, bought her some breathing room, loosened the grip that had held a certain shape in place. But the real work was hers. The therapy, the hard conversations, the decision to leave, the trip to Portugal, the phone call to Patrice, the slow process of remembering who she was before she got lost inside someone else's family. I couldn't do any of that for her. Nobody could. What I hope, if you take anything from this, is just the reminder that the people who love you are watching even when you think they're not. And that it is never too late to ask yourself the question Claire finally asked, "Who am I?" outside of all of this. The answer is still there. It's waiting, and you are allowed to go find it.